Okay, 10:02. Let's get this party going.
Okay.
And thank you for Tanil and Sarah for being here. Love it.
Can I just say something really quick, Kari?
Yeah, please.
Like, we're all friends. But because this is recording, I'll probably still present this in a little bit more of a formal setting instead of just like chatting it up. Okay.
I love it. Okay, welcome to the parent meetup for March. We have the wonderful Molly Cowley with us to be talking about neurodivergent learners and how to best help them and how to incorporate our teaching to best suit their learning. Molly is a neurodivergent violinist and teacher herself. She graduated from BYU in violin performance in 2015 and has maintained a Suzuki studio of 20 to 30 students since then. She performs as a concertmaster for the Bountiful Philharmonica, and she subs for Ballet West, as well as doing freelance recording work. Molly lives in Bountiful with her incredible husband and 4 beautiful kids, some of who are also neurodivergent and who all play string instruments. So Molly, thanks so much for being here, and take it away.
Thanks, Kari. Okay, so before we just dive in, I want to say to any parents of neurodivergent music students, you're my hero. And I'm really not being facetious. Your job as a practice parent first is many times harder than the parent of a neurotypical student. And in addition, your kids benefit from music training probably more than any other type of child. So though it is the hardest work, it's some of the most important work. And so I just wanted to take a moment and just like honor you and express to you my heartfelt gratitude for being in this work. And thanks, Jamil. And I'm kind of speaking also to the hypothetical audience that hopefully people who watch this in retrospect too. So on days where you have only 40%, but you gave 40%, you gave 100%. I love this quote by Jim Quick. It's such an important reminder because it's easy to get burned out as parents of neurodivergent kids or as neurodivergents. It's just really easy to get burned out. And one of the things about the autism spectrum is people on the autism spectrum tend to take things really literally. And so it's hard for us to gauge what 100% is. Like where a neurotypical person might say, like have a boundary of where they gave it their all. Often people who are neurodivergent, when you think like give it your all, we accidentally give way more than we should because we just don't have like the same ability to figure out where those expectations start and end. So this is just me saying like, take care of yourself. And I wanted to ask how many of you are teachers and how many of you are parents, but I know all 3 of you and I know a lot about you. So I think I got my audience pinned down. Okay, and it's important for me to say this. What does not qualify me to give this presentation? So first, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a therapist, and I'm not a medical researcher. So I'm going to try my best to cite sources responsibly. So I just that's like a disclaimer for you there. But these are the ways that I am qualified to talk about this. So I'm a neurodivergent professional violinist. So I know how ADHD has affected my own learning for the past 30 years. And it still affects my learning and my practice today. So I'll try to speak to that at some point. And then also I've experienced all 3 sides of the neurodivergent Suzuki triangle. I've heard so many people say this like, oh, I've experienced all 3 sides of the triangle. And then this just occurred to me last night as I was putting some of these slides together. So I have been the ADHD violin student with an ADHD mom. And I'm not sure, but I feel quite certain that at least one of my teachers was ADHD. I also have been the ADHD teacher of neurodivergent students. So I've had diagnosed ADHD and autism spectrum students, as well as some other neurodivergent traits, which we'll cover. And I think I have also had many who are not diagnosed, but, and that's for 10 plus years I've been doing that work. And I'm sure some of my parents in my studio, I know, diagnosed, some of them are neurodivergent and some undiagnosed. And then I've also been an ADHD mom of an ADHD student, my daughter, who's 10 years old. And I also, okay, yeah, we'll leave it at that. So here are my kids, and you all know them. But Amelia, my oldest, she's 10, and she has been diagnosed with ADHD. Grace, my cellist, is 7, and I believe she's neurotypical, but we'll cover this too. It's kind of hard to know because when it comes to neurodivergence, symptoms, you could have the same diagnosis and present vastly different symptoms. So what I can say is that Amelia and Grace have totally different ways of interfacing with the world, and practicing with them and supporting them in their music learning is completely different. And then Kate is 5 now. She was 4 in this picture, and she has not been diagnosed, but when the time is right, we'll probably pursue meeting with professionals to try to understand how her brain works, because it is also different. And then this is my 2-year-old Finn. And at the time we did this family photo shoot, he wasn't playing, but now he's playing violin. And he is absolutely ADHD. I'm almost positive. But I'm going to get to this. It's important if you are not a medical professional, it is important to always make these kind of judgments with a little bit of tempered and understanding that you, the appropriate sources or avenues to go through to get those diagnoses. So I wanted to say that all brains are unique. So that's what I was just saying. So you shouldn't diagnose your student or your child without the help of a professional. That would just be kind of medically irresponsible. But you can and should treat each child you encounter with curiosity and try to understand what makes them tick and how your teaching style or parenting style is going to cater to their unique mind. So in some ways, the labels are not vital. If you are sensitive to the unique traits of each of your students or your children, then the labels in a way are not necessary. But having the labels can help categorize symptoms and can give you like structure in your research, and can sometimes help like streamline your efforts. Because for instance, like once my daughter was diagnosed with ADHD, now I have sort of specific labels to look for as I do my research, and almost always it like fills in, versus just trial and error. So that's kind of my thought about diagnosis. This book changed my life when I first read it. Michelle Monahan Horner is a classical guitar teacher, a Suzuki teacher in Brooklyn. And she wrote this book. It's about learning styles. So she developed her own system of categorizing learning styles, and she colored them. And they don't have anything to do with personality colors in any other system. So that's one thing to know about this. But this book is an amazing resource when it comes to just believing that each child is its own system and treating it as a unique system. And so I highly recommend, like, even if you don't think that you have students or children with neurodivergence, this covers all sorts of learning styles of all kinds of brains. And so it's really practical and helpful, and it has helped me so much. In fact, this was the thing that saved our violin learning. So Amelia, I think she was 4 or 5 when I read this book, and I was ready to throw in the towel. I was so overwhelmed with practice with her. I used to just cry to people and be like, how do you do it? And now I know we were up against more than some people are up against. But it was in this book that I identified her color. And then through that, it really gave me like some great techniques to try, but also just like understanding her and then being patient that the process with her was going to be different. And Michelle Horner goes through all that in this book. So highly recommend it. if you are the parent of a neurodivergent child, you're going to need to be their advocate. And I just want to say, I might cry a lot in this. I didn't expect to feel so emotional, but I know you didn't sign up for this. But they're a part of you. And so you are able to do this. I know you are. And I just want to give you that confidence that no one is going to stand up for or advocate for your child better than you are. So it's really important to get clear on your why about your music lessons and not let anyone else tell you what it is. Because, we'll go over more the because of that as it comes along. But I would highly recommend, if you feel that your child is involved in music lessons in some way to fulfill you, like a need you have, or just by default, or maybe it's not serving them like it used to or something like that, I just highly recommend taking time to sit and journal and maybe, or talk it out with someone and get clear on like, why are we doing this? Because you're, again, are going to be up against so much more than other parents. And so if you don't have that really clear, first, you might give up easier. And second, if you understand your why, it's really going to shape the how of what you do in practice. You'll see what I mean. So also be conscious that progress might not look the same for your child. That was kind of the first with Amelia, with my oldest. That was one of the big milestones for me, was seeing, like, once she had been taking lessons for about 5 or 6 years, I could finally start to kind of see the patterns and the arch of her progression and start to treat her like an autonomous, beautiful human, having her own human experience that I didn't need to co-opt or didn't need to like squish into someone else's shape of what they looked like. So like for my child who has ADHD, her progress is not, and I don't know that anyone's is linear, but like I have taught lots and lots of violin students over 10 to 15 years. And more than anyone else I have taught, her progress comes in fits and bursts. So we will have long periods of what seems like stagnation, and then short periods of like insane progress. And that's kind of one of the hallmarks of ADHD too. So just being, it could look really different in each child, but just being like, knowing your why and being open to the fact that it's going to look different for your child. So we need to define some terms. Neurodivergence isn't actually a medical term, but what it means is the people who have differences in how their brains work. So this is a definition from Cleveland Medical Clinic, and there are other people who define it differently, but this was a good jumping off point for us today. So it's still true that even for people with the same medical diagnosis, even people with the same diagnosis, their brain on a brain scan might look completely different, because often the diagnoses that are given, and this is starting to change, but historically they're given based on behavioral observations. And so there could be totally different mechanisms in the brain causing the same behaviors. So that's just something to be aware of. And then vice versa, it might mean that people with the same diagnosis have totally different behaviors from each other. So here are some of the disorders, they're often called, but I'm not exactly sure I think of it that way anymore. But here are some of the conditions that might fall under neurodivergence. So autism spectrum disorder, and some of the challenges that kids on this autism spectrum might bump up against are communication challenges, social interactions, and sensory processing. And then ADHD, some of their challenges they might bump up against are attention, focus, impulse control. But then we also have things, so those are usually like the two things that people think of. And ADHD has now been categorized on the autism spectrum. But some other things that fall under neurodivergence as like an umbrella are dyslexia, which is reading and spelling, dyscalculia, I don't know if I pronounced that exactly right, which is challenges with math, dyspraxia, which is challenges with motor skills and coordination, Tourette's syndrome, which is involuntary movement and sounds, OCD, and anxiety and depression, which Some people don't categorize that under neurodivergence, but they maybe see it as like a very likely offshoot of someone who has neurodivergence living in our society today, which is interesting. So our capitalist go society is very challenging for people with neurodivergence and has not really been built to support them. So that's something I'm hoping changes over the years. That while I'm still alive, I hope I get to benefit from that. So the ones that kind of I have experience with are autism spectrum and ADHD. So that's kind of what I'm going to be speaking to today, but I hope that a lot of the stuff we talk about applies to the others. If you have people in your studio that you know are experiencing those other specific things. So often when we talk about autism spectrum, people assume the top image here, like a sliding scale. For instance, you might hear terminology like saying, this child is high functioning autistic. So that's actually kind of like a blunt tool. Like that's not a very effective communication when we talk about autism spectrum, because we have lots, the spectrum, as you see on the bottom with the sphere, is actually like a wide variety of skills and experiences. And then each person is going to fall in a different place within these different skills. So in this particular system, they have split it into 5 categories: language, motor skills, perception, executive function, and sensory. But here's another one. And I didn't do the math ahead of time, but I think that's 12 different categories. So you can see that the science is still developing, and the terminology and the way we communicate about these challenges are still flexible. So again, we just need to be cognizant and flexible about how we treat each person. So this book, I'm going to put this book at the end. It's one of my favorite resources about understanding autism, and it's called Unmasking Autism. This is what Devin Price says about this. So autism is neurological. It is a developmental disability that runs in families and appears to be largely genetically heritable. However, it's multiply determined. So that means it doesn't have a single cause. And I'm just going to say that she is speaking from all of the science that she could draw from. This book was published in 2023. So people have really strong opinions about this. I understand. But this is the closest science that we have right now. Okay, so every autistic brain is unique and exhibits its own distinct patterns of connectivity. So autistic people have differences in development of their anterior cingulate cortex. So that's a part of the brain that regulates attention, decision-making, impulse control, emotional processing. So they have unique connection patterns that deviate from what is normally observed. So a neurotypical person would be someone who, like, if you scanned their brain and understood how it connects, it follows a pattern that you see repeating over and over again. And then someone on the autism spectrum, it's not that they fall into a recognizable pattern, it's that they don't fall into a recognizable pattern. So it's like they are in the catch-all category of like, this is not what we would normally expect. So some regions remain hyper-connected throughout their life, while others are going to remain underconnected. And again, there are multiple reasons why the brain has been hyperconnected or underconnected, but it's just important to understand that all the behaviors that we're seeing are coming from that issue, as well as neurochemicals, which we'll get to in a second. So why did I say at the beginning, I feel so passionate that these kids are perfect for music training? And it's because playing an instrument is one of the best ways to connect the hemispheres of the brain. So one of the main processes happening in this child's brain is that their connections are different. That's not to say they're less, but I believe that learning violin as a child actually is like why I am as functional as I am, because I had so many hours of connecting different hemispheres of my brain. So this is from an article put out by Harvard, just explaining all the different parts of the brain that are engaged when we play a musical instrument. And they actually used violin as their example, but I think a lot of musical instruments have the same effect. So good for your neurodivergent child. Like, it's really, really good for them. And it's so hard for them and for you. But I'm like, it's a worthy cause. Another thing I want to input here is that as a neurodivergent individual who has carved out a career in music, I think that music was like the perfect pick for me, because I get to have so much flexibility in my schedule. I get, like, I'm like working for myself. That's really great for me to be able to gauge for myself how much energy I have to give at a certain moment, because it's very easy for neurodivergent people to have burnout. Also, I have a little bit of oppositional defiance disorder. So that means, like, I don't love when people tell me what to do. And I've learned over the years how to respond to that better. But that's just one of the, that's very commonly comorbid with ADHD. And so it's one of the knee-jerk reactions that I have to regulate and deal with. But the fact that I'm self-employed means that I have less of that than I would if I worked 9 to 5 for somebody else who was constantly making demands on my time and my energy. Also, we'll talk about special interests, but like violin is my special interest. So I don't really burn out of doing it. So in that way, music was like a perfect career choice for me. And also the way I connect with people through music, and I feel socially supported by being connected with others in an emotional way when I perform, that is very good to feed my system. So I just want to say that as we talk about how neurodivergent kids might bump up against challenges in the practice room, it might be easy to be like, and so we're going to not do this because it's so much harder. But this actually might be like the biggest gift you can give to them. Like, this might be exactly where they belong. They just need either more support or just different support. So we're going to talk about different support. Okay, so neurodivergence, when we talk about ADHD, which is on the autism spectrum, or autism, one of the theories of the main challenges, like where these challenges come from, is actually a dysregulated nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for multiple physiological responses, and dysfunction of this system contributes to the cognitive, affective, and behavioral responses observed in autistic children. So atypical autonomic arousal can explain some core symptoms of autism, like repetitive behavior, social difficulties, avoidance, stimming, and self-injurious behavior. Sorry, I'm like speed talking that. You can read it. But the point being that if we can really help these kids' nervous systems to be regulated, that alone will go a long ways in helping treat the symptoms. So this isn't treating the cause, because the cause is somewhere inside their brain. We're not actually changing the brain probably at this point, but we're helping to calm the system so that the way that these behaviors exhibit can be sort of like calmed. So the first thing to do in practice, so you can imagine like a nervous system that's dysregulated. How would you treat if you encountered someone with a dysregulated nervous system? Like, how are you going to treat them? Or you could think of like an injured animal. That if you found like a wild animal injured in your yard, they're in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn right now, right? Their nervous system is on high alert. So how would you treat that animal? That's sometimes helpful for me in remembering how to be gentle with my students or with my children who I know have their nervous systems are constantly on high alert. And it's a dysregulation. It's not, their nervous system is responding disappropriately to their physical experience. Does that make sense? So they're not actually in danger, but their nervous system cannot tell that. And that has to do with the connectivity of the brain, and also has to do with their neurochemicals. And we'll talk about that in a second. But when it actually comes to the practical sides of like being, helping this child to have a regulated nervous system, the first step is to be emotionally grounded yourself. So a lot of neurodivergent children are empaths. They're really good at picking up on emotions, which is also partially why their nervous system gets dysregulated, because they can just feel everything coming at them. So you got to be the calm in the storm. You got to have taken time to ground and regulate before practice. And I love this quote by Christine Goodner, who is a Suzuki teacher and pioneer in practice. When practice environments come up for discussion, I usually hear lots of physical descriptions, like it's a good idea to find a spot in the house that always be used, blah, 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 blah. Okay, these are important pieces of advice, but I encourage you to think of the practice environment as something else completely. You, the parent, are the practice environment. So like your internal environment really is going to affect them, whether you're teaching or practicing with these kids. Now, you also, after you've got that, that's the part that you can control, because that's you. There's a lot you can't control. You can't control anything outside of you, truly, right? But anyway, once you do that, the next step I would say is probably do everything you can do in the outside environment to help them know that they are safe. So that could be like speaking kindly to them, for instance, honoring their emotions when they have them, and like having space for them to have feelings that you maybe don't agree with, but they know that this is a safe place for them. A lot of ADHD specifically kids have rejection sensitivity dysphoria. This is like an intense emotional reaction to perceived rejections. So I suffer from this, have my whole life. And so someone with RSD might be labeled as like a sensitive person, like, oh, you're really sensitive. Or it could be like that could be in a positive way or a negative way, like, oh, you're so sensitive, you're so like, you're a crybaby, or you take things too hard. So like when I was growing up, my dad made it his like personal mission, I feel like, and he was a very kind father, to like kind of toughen me up, you know, like I was like too sensitive. So he was always like, let's go do hard things. And like, cause you know, and unfortunately, that really doesn't work for these kinds of kids. You know, there are ways to help strengthen their vagal nerve, which is going to help their nervous system, and we'll talk about them. But just being tough on them is going to have the opposite effect. And Michelle Horner actually talks about that in that Life Lens book. Some of the colors, she's like, this color, be tough on them. This color, do not be tough on them, you know? And so anyways, these kids may not seem like they are devastated by criticism. They may have like developed a mask to seem that they are not affected. But if you know that someone in your studio, or if you know that your child has ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, you need to know that they are sensitive to criticism. And if it doesn't seem like it, it's because that they have encountered it so much that they're hardening and they're putting that mask on. And you might think that that's like working, like, oh, good, now they're not so sensitive. But in reality, their nervous system is like firing on all cylinders all the time, and they do not feel safe. So with this, I kind of mentioned, oh yeah, so let me explain how this has played out in my life personally. So someone with rejection sensitivity dysphoria is highly perceptible to patterns of procrastination. So when I was growing up, my first violin teacher, who I still love with my whole heart because she gave me this gift, was pretty old school, and she was very tough on me. And so I would have a lot of anxiety knowing that lessons were going to be, so in RSD, you can have physical pain comes from rejection. So you'll have like a trauma response. So someone who, the kind of response, well, this might sound trite, but I'll just share my personal experience. So my father passed away when I was 16. And when I received the phone call that he had passed away, so I took the phone to my mom, and together they told us over the phone. And that feeling in my body, my nervous system and trauma response, having that, I've actually felt it many times later, much smaller situations. So like someone calling me and saying, Your car is in my way. Could you move it out of the parking spot it's in? And my body is going, my dad died. Right? Like that's the intensity that these kids feel the criticism. So as I've regulated my own nervous system, I've actually been doing a lot of work with this year. I'm getting way better at that. And I'm able to like tease that out and separate it. But I'm just like trying to show you just like how sensitive they are and how deeply they feel these things. So for me, I would get into executive function freeze. Like I couldn't practice. Like I knew that I was supposed to, but because my anxiety about my being in my lesson was looming so high, I would just get stuck. And I would just sit and feel guilty and be like, I need to practice. I can't practice. I need to practice. I can't practice. And it was this constant battle. And then and so this is true with any kind of procrastination in my life. And I think it's probably true for a lot of people who procrastinate. The thing that finally gets you to move is that the anxiety of the pain of the social rejection is higher than the discomfort of not having enough dopamine to get moving. So it's just like, that's a very intense way to live. That's a very, that's not a sustainable way to live and function. It leads to a lot of burnout. So what you can do for your children is try to be gentle with them so that they don't have that anxiety and that like fear of having those emotional responses to your criticism and you're being hard on them. So one thing I do with my daughter, who is very sensitive to my criticism, even if I couch it, like I'm always couching it like, oh, wow, that was so wonderful. I wonder what could happen if you bent your thumb, like just being like, oh yeah, no, she sees right through that. And she's like crying and like, I knew it, you hate me. And like, no. So one thing that I have learned to do with her, I call it a compliment power hour, but it's not a full hour usually. But especially I do this when she's doing her review songs, is if I just compliment her, just like anything that I see that I want her to do more of, I just say, that's amazing. You're doing that amazing. You're doing that amazing. You're doing that amazing. And then if I have like one technical thing that I'm thinking I would really love her to work on, so let's just like use it as an example that maybe she's struggling to bend her thumb in her bow hand. What I'm actually going to do is watch and wait. And the first moment I see a little bit of a bend, I'm going to be like, stop, that was amazing. Like instead of telling her, bend your thumb, bend your thumb, bend your thumb, which maybe isn't good teaching for anybody, but maybe for a neurotypical person is like the kind of like little jabs that they can deal with emotionally. Whereas someone on the spectrum, that's going to maybe just feel very overwhelming to have those little interruptions. And there's other reasons for that too, we'll get to. So instead, I'm going to watch and then I'm going to celebrate when it's good. That gave her dopamine. Now she's more likely to do it again without me having to actually correct her, if that makes sense. So this is the kind of creativity sometimes these kids need. And I know it's exhausting. And sometimes I get really discouraged myself and just feel like I can't keep going. I can't do it. Okay. So, Christine Goodner also says, before your child's old enough and competent enough to practice on their own, you'll be a big part of the process. This is just for any kid. But what we say to them now when things are hard and when we don't want them to give up shapes what they'll often say to themselves later. I really love that quote. So again, even though this work is really hard, like, isn't this cool that you're in the trenches with them? Because once they get out into the world, like they are going to bump up against so much feeling of not fitting in. And your voice will be in their head. And your voice will either be saying like, yeah, you don't fit in and work harder and be different than what is natural for you. Or your voice is going to be saying like, you got this, we can do this, don't give up. And that's cool and powerful. We're pretty cool as parents. So another thing that helps regulate the nervous system, this is scientifically proven, is breath work. So I wanted to teach you a couple of different things you can do for breathing. The first one is called the physiological sigh. And if you are able to, let's all like do these together. So the physiological sigh, babies actually do it. Once we do it, you're going to recognize it. You take a deep breath in and you want to use your diaphragm. So let your belly expand and you go as much as you can. And then you go a little bit more and then let it all out fast. So it goes. So let's try that together. So you can imagine a baby who's been crying and then nurses or just gets held by their parents, you can think like, ah, like, you know how babies do that? So that's actually a natural, what do you call that? Reflex that helps calm the nervous system, but we can like recreate it if we're, because these kids, they are in so much distress sometimes that they're completely dissociated. They're not really feeling their body. They're not. So if they were feeling the emotion in their body and were connecting to it, where that might naturally be something their body would do because of the environment that they are constantly in that is not supporting their needs, they might be dissociating and not even like feeling the tendency that their body has to support them. So helping them to do that can help trigger and help trigger the supportive response for their nervous system. So then there's belly breathing. So we don't have to lie on the ground, but that's where you lie on the ground and you put your hands on your belly and you just feel it getting big and small. And you just like kind of notice the feeling of the rise and fall. And that's quite calming. So then there's also one that's like smell a flower. So sometimes I do this in my lessons. I'll pull out an imaginary flower and be like, smell the flower. You know, if I see a kid that seems dysregulated and I'm like, did you smell it? Did you really smell? Try again, you know, and what I'm trying to do is get them to like really get in a deep breath and let it out. And then balloon breathing is like belly breathing kind of, but you're imagining that there's a balloon inside. And then you're letting the air out. So just some of these images are really helpful for kids. Snake breathing, you take a deep breath in. Again, you're always encouraging them to have their tummy come out so they're getting their whole lungs filled. And then you hiss it out like a snake. So that can be kind of a fun one. I love doing birthday candles in lessons with my students and with my own kids. It started because I would sometimes like have my beads upstairs where my kids practice, forget to bring them into my lesson, don't want to go get them. So I'm like, okay, well, I've got 5 birthday candles. For each one you do, blow one out, right? But if I have a kid who's a little dysregulated in their lesson and they go to blow it out, I pretend it's a trick candle. So I'm like, oh, no, it didn't go out. Harder. And then finally, of course, they're like breathing, you know? And then there's rainbow breathing, which is remembering or imagining, that they're different colors. So that's just like some of these kids have really incredible imaginations. That's one of the things that makes them so special in this world. So some of my students really love the rainbow breathing. And then back-to-back breathing. This is, I wouldn't do this with a student probably, but I will do it with my kids. We sit back to back with each other on the ground and then breathe together. And we try to match each other's breathing because you can kind of like feel. So that's like kind of a really calming sensory thing. And that comes into the body pressure that these kids crave sometimes too. And we'll get to that. Then there's square breathing where you count to 4 times. So like, and sometimes you could even put on a metronome with this. So like in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. So that's why it's called square, because you can kind of get that. And then bumblebee breathing is like the snake one. They just like buzz like a bee. But the buzzing, and if you're a vocalist, you know this, in order to buzz your lips, you have to have quite a bit of air coming out. So that's actually really helpful because these kids will end up, again, like if they're just listening, they're not really like inhabiting their body very well, they'll tend to do quite shallow breaths. And so the buzzing is forcing them to get their breathing deeper. So it's kind of fun. So those are some fun ones. Okay, now there's something called proprioceptive input. So that's basically like, again, to help these kids ground, because they'll sometimes just be, I mean, I know I was, the way my ADHD manifested as a child was not hyperactively, but inattentively, which now ADD and ADHD are categorized as the same thing. And they kind of think of the hyperactive element being like mental for people who are the inattentive type. So it's like, I would be sitting in class and my teacher, it's like, it was literally like the Charlie Brown movie. You know, the adults are like, wah, 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 wah. Like that's going on up there. And meanwhile, I'm like world building. Like in my head, I have written full series of fantasy novels. I'm just like existing in my own place, doing my own thing, right? And so I'm not really in my body. This is like part of the challenge that these kids have. And so here are some things that can help with proprioceptive input, which is also going to calm the nervous system. Weighted blankets, long, strong hugs. And I want to also say, Remember, every kid's brain is different. So some kids on the autism spectrum, these are like perfect torture. So you have to be sensitive to knowing like what your kid likes and the trial and error. Compression chair, you can look up what that is. Compression clothing. So this is a surprising one that I only learned like a couple years ago. People on the autism spectrum sometimes love to wear Under Armour under their regular clothes. So having that compression just helps calm their nervous system all day. So you could experiment with that. Like if I put my kid in, you know what I mean by Under Armour, like sports, like you might like see like a baseball player playing that wearing that under their uniform or something. So you could go buy some, and they also make one specifically for kids on the spectrum that don't have like any itchy seams or anything. So you can look, or tags that might bother them. Bouncing on an exercise ball, that's proprioceptive input. They're getting like pressure as they bounce. So could you have that available in practice and like take breaks? You know, like when the timer goes off, go bounce on your ball for a while. Like that's going to calm their nervous system. Chewing crunchy things. This is a great one. It's so surprising, but it works so well. So like corn nuts, I mean, I'm going to just say that like maybe your local dentist or orthopedic surgeon might disagree with me, but like corn nuts or jerky can be as well, but specifically the crunchy things. I actually know someone who eats raw rice. That's one that I've never really been interested in, but that kind of crunching can really calm their nervous system. It just gives the body some proprioceptive input, helps ground them back into their body, bring them back from like the stratosphere where they're existing. Chewing gum can. Now, this is a little tricky because I do have a student who has ADHD who comes in with gum, and I want to be supporting her in her sensory needs, but chewing gum with violin really disrupts. It can be dangerous for the violin can fall, right? Like it can be disruptive. So that one, maybe depending on the student. And this is funny because I mean, when I was growing up, it was like a cardinal sin to chew gum while you play violin, right? Like that was like, oh, that would be like the worst. Your teacher would get so mad at you. But this is the kind of environment I'm trying to create in my home and in my studio, is like respecting that we have to weigh the pros and cons here. So if they're not getting what their nervous system needs to be regulated, they are not going to learn anyway. They're not going to be able to, because they will be so focused on just like being still, for instance. Or this is a really common one on the autism spectrum. Look at my eyes when I speak. Kids who they are masking. If you have taught them over and over and over again, look at my eyes when I speak, they're not actually able to listen to you. They're just focused all their attention on looking at you because that's what that you said to do. Do you want them to look at your eyes, or do you want them to hear what you're saying? Like you have to decide your order of priorities here, if that makes sense. So anyway, so that's like with the gum chewing. I'm like sort of like on the fence with that. I just kind of take it case by case, I guess. Then like jumping, swinging, spinning, that's really good for proprioceptive input. So we have a therapy swing that we thought when we put it in our living room, or our toy room here, we thought that our kids were going to sit in it and read. We were so wrong. It is like full trapeze out there. It's Greatest Showman every day. And my students as well. And my students who are on the spectrum, I have suggested to their parents, bring them 5 or 10 minutes early and let them play on the swing, because they come back in more regulated. If they're out there like, and I have to say, like, we have triple checked that this is safe, because they go crazy on that thing, but it is locked into a beam. It's not going anywhere, but it's a big space around it. And they really will like running start, and they're just swinging. Those kids come into lessons like so ready to work. It's fun. It's fun. So that was just like a happy mistake, but cool. And then there's also wobble chairs. You can look up what that is, but if they can sit in practice, I think this wouldn't work for cello, obviously. Each instrument's going to have its challenges, but like violin, if you're allowing them to sit in the practice or part of the practice, they could have their wobble chair. And then fidget toys are really helpful for proprioceptive input. So here are some tools that I use for when I see kids that are dysregulated. So this is, I don't know if any of you have like gotten clued into Neato. It's a brand that has like all these interesting sensory toys, and they're really popular right now. But anyway, it's just like I don't know if you kind of see the feeling of this. It's like a squishy toy, but it takes a long time to squish back. This is actually great for little kids' hand strength too. So my little cellist, this is the one I bought for her, and she's been going on. I was like, I told her she could only use her left hand for a while because we've been working on keeping her fingers. She has like her collapsed knuckles, and it's really helping. So that's exciting. But it's also really, if you hear your child being like, oh, that's so satisfying, you just struck gold. If they find something satisfying, you know how that's something people say now, that's giving them dopamine and it's regulating their nervous system. So like buy 100 of those things and keep them around your house and in your practice room. So that's something that's so satisfying. Here's another neato toy. And I use this in my lessons as well to teach like flexible knuckles in the bow hand and even in the left hand. But again, like the touch of this for some kids on the spectrum might be like, so like one of my icks is flour. I hate baking because the flour gives me nails on the chalkboard. So sad because I love eating baked goods. Luckily, my husband's an incredible baker, so that was meant to be. But like, so this might give one kid the ick, and then it might give one kid the tingles, and they love it. So you just have to know. You have to try to continue. This is like this bean bag. It has, it gives like a specific sound, and some of my kids like, ooh, that's nice. Like that gives them some dopamine, you know? So having a break that they can do that. Or we can use this in lessons like if they're, tense in their shoulders, keep it on their shoulder there. Well, you can see it's kind of tricky. It depends on the texture of what they're wearing too. But just some manipulatives that can like give them dopamine. And then this was kind of fun. I wanted to show because my daughter, who is ADHD, just came up with talk to her about this is called a sensory board or texture board. Anyway, I've never mentioned it to her. I've seen them before that like kids on the spectrum do it. She did it herself. She just brought this to me one day and she's like, I made a sensory board. I was like, okay. So you can see she put in, these are glue sticks. We use glue sticks like clay at our house. We cut them and glue them together, and I should probably find like a more economic way because we go through glue sticks like crazy. These are like for a hot glue gun. And then this is foam. And this is she made a texture with her glue gun that you can like feel. This is just the cardboard, but it has the corrugated feel. So she can hear that sound while she goes, and this is just like a soft fabric. But anyway, that's interesting. So we bring this in her practice. And if she's dysregulated, she stops and does something with her texture board for a while, And then these are not the earmuffs I have. These are just my noise canceling headphones. So these are the fancy version of what I'm about to tell you about. But actually, I got to change slides. We're going to get to that. Well, I'll just do it now because it's on my mind. So consider having a pair of earmuffs. I use them all the time in my studio. So I just found them on Amazon, and they're like the kind that you imagine like putting on a baby when you go to like a loud sports event or mowing the lawn or something, I cannot believe how many, this is a discovery I made like a year and a half ago, how many of my students in my studio don't play with really full tone because it bothers them. Like the sound triggers something in them that they really don't like. So they play soft. And so sticking those earmuffs on them and having them play with really full tone has been extremely helpful. It helps them to have more endurance in their practice. It's good for their hearing anyway. We should not probably be practicing for long hours without hearing protection anyway. Also, another added benefit, they are going to be really great in the recording studio someday. So anyone who's done recording work knows, like when you go in, you're wearing the headphones, it's pretty disorienting. Like you start to not really trust what you're hearing from your violin. Well, if you practice like this a lot anyway, you'll be great. And I don't notice that it affects intonation negatively. In fact, I think it's improving intonation for some kids because it's reducing some of like the extra sounds that come, and so they're really tuning into like the actual pitch. I know that with intonation we're also looking for sympathetic vibrations, but I can still hear them when I'm wearing my earmuffs. So okay, now we talk about dopamine. So that was all like nervous system stuff, but dopamine is one of the big driving factors behind it's the chemical of more. So it's the driving factor behind motivation basically. And in kids with autism spectrum disorder, they always exhibit that their dopaminergic systems are dysregulated. So if your brain isn't getting enough dopamine, it's really hard to focus on anything else. Kari, do I have till 11? Okay. So basically you can imagine some of the times that our brain gives us dopamine is like when we eat food. So when we eat something specifically, something with carbohydrates, our bodies over thousands, it's debatable how many years, maybe even millions of years of evolution, have learned that that food is going to be good for our body and contribute to us surviving as an organism. And so our brain learned to be like, ping, happy feeling. So like, you eat something, ping, dopamine. And that's teaching your brain. It's like a self conditioning to say, keep eating this food. Okay, so if your brain isn't getting enough dopamine, it thinks that it's starving. It thinks that you aren't going to survive as an individual organism. Because that's kind of what would happen if like you weren't eating, or if you didn't have shelter or something like that, your brain wouldn't be getting enough dopamine. It's trying to tell you like, we need to survive. So you can imagine that someone who is totally eating enough, has shelter, is taken care of, but they have a dysregulation, so they're not getting the dopamine. It's like this, it's the wrong signal. Their brain's getting the wrong signal. How could you focus on anything else if your brain thinks you're dying right now? It's very hard to focus on something like violin when your brain thinks that you're not going to live till tomorrow. So this is one, it's believed to be, again, the science is always developing, but it's believed to be one of the mechanisms that's contributing to a lot of the challenges that come to being neurodivergent. So one way you can know that your kid isn't getting enough their brain doesn't have quite enough dopamine, is zoning out or not blinking. So when we when we have regular dopamine just kind of trickling in a way that a healthy brain does, we blink at regular intervals. So you can watch a video of someone, and if they're blinking at a regular interval, that means they're also getting dopamine at a regular interval. And if you watch someone and they're like zoning out, and then they blink all of a sudden and come back to you, that's an indication to you. They could just be tired too, but again, dopamine plays into fatigue. But that might be an indication to you that they don't have dopamine. And so that's always interesting to me too, because I have contacts. So when I blink and I'm like, oh, my eyes were so dry, shoot, when was the last time I blinked? I'm like, oh, okay, I'm struggling with my dopamine today. So most stimulant medications are working on the dopaminergic system. They're either directly giving you more dopamine, or they're helping your brain to maintain the dopamine that it has. So I take a stimulant and it really helps me. Caffeine is slowing the rate of dopamine uptake. So it's like shutting off the reuptake. It's a reuptake inhibitor. So it's keeping whatever dopamine they do have like bumping around in there. So that works for everybody. That's true. It works like that for every brain. So for someone who's neurotypical, who has enough dopamine, you shut those reuptake receptors, and they're going to stay awake. Their brain's like boing, 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 dopamine. Well, if you do that with a kid whose nervous system has been constantly dysregulated, you could shut those receptors. Now they barely have enough dopamine to feel safe. They're going to take a nap. That happens more often than you think. These hyperactive kids will drink caffeine and then like zonk out. And that's because like they were in such a deficit that their body is like, oh my gosh, we are going to live. We are safe. Now so it's kind of interesting. I'm not telling you to give your kid caffeine, but it's just an interesting fact to know about how that brain works. And I think you could look into it if you want. You should always do these kinds of, like when we're talking about medication or any playing with chemicals, I highly recommend consulting your pediatrician. So with dopamine, as teachers, we're often saving little rewards as like carrots. If you do the thing, I'll give you the reward. But the truth is that if you are that low on dopamine, you need some dopamine to get started. You just cannot. And that's what we call being in freeze and executive dysfunction. So you might considering starting your lessons with these kids or your practices with these kids with a little reward, or just getting them some kind of dopamine to get moving. So for me, taking my stimulant in the morning is what does that for me. But and my daughter takes a stimulant as well. But for my kids who are not diagnosed and don't take a stimulant, if I know we're going to have like a tough practice and we're struggling to get started, I start with the treat, which I know is like, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it really works. So other natural ways to increase dopamine for your kid, if they can get in the sunlight in the morning for 10 or 15 minutes, that's been proven to marginally increase dopamine. It may not do it a lot, but it does a little. Cold exposure. There's something called smooth pursuit eye movements. You could look it up. It's following a single object with your eye slowly. So people with dopamine disorders, which by the way, anyone can have a dopamine disorder. It's actually pretty common now because we are in dopamine overload with like all of our media that we consume. That doesn't mean that it's a biological disorder. It just means it's a conditioning disorder. So when people say, oh, everybody's a little ADHD these days, okay, everyone has a little bit of dopamine resistance these days. I'll buy that because we're just like always on our phone and we're getting these like free hits of dopamine that we didn't earn and they're coming too quickly. So we're getting like resistant to them. But a neurotypical person could reprogram themselves and get back to like homeostasis. Whereas a neurodivergent person, they're biologically like someone who has been amputated and needs like a prosthetic, you know, like their brain's never going to do it quite the same way. So having those smooth eye movements, that's a good one to start your practice with or your students, because that can increase dopamine for like the next 20 to 30 minutes if you spend just 2 or 3 minutes having them follow a single object, like a little toy or something. Oh, because with low dopamine, their eyes will dart around. That's what I was going to say. We tend to be kind of like fidgety and darty. So anyway, then regular physical exercise is going to be great. Swimming is great for kids on the spectrum because it combines the breath work element, the exercise, and they get sensory deprivation. They're in the water, and so they're not like constantly bothered by the sensory stuff. So find your child's special interest and use that to give them dopamine. So if your child like loves dinosaurs, they probably love it, your neurodivergent child. They probably love it because something about it gives it dopamine. Why is that? I have no idea. Probably no one could ever tell you why. These brains are mysterious and magical, okay? But if you notice it happening, take advantage of it. Do everything dinosaur, right? Or same with your students. And then try to make it playful because that's going to help also increase the dopamine. Okay, so Kari, I could for sure go for 10 more minutes, but if we're not allowed to, I can just wrap up. What should we do?
I actually have to teach at 11.
Yeah,
So
nice.
unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But this
Well,
has been so wonderful. And I need to go back and study all of this. And I've learned so much about myself and about one child that I have in particular. And I mean, yes, this needs to go on for like another hour and then an hour of questioning because I mean, I know you're not a doctor and, you know, all these reasons why you're not qualified, but by golly, you have given like so many tips and tricks and like just opened my eyes to so many things. And I thought that I knew a lot, but I don't.
Yeah, well, I still have so much to learn too. Well, I will say I know all of you and I have your emails. So, oh, Marin, I'm not sure if I do yours if you're interested in it, but I can send you the rest of the slides because they're kind of self-explanatory with more of the ideas. So
I would love that. That would be awesome.
Maybe Kari, I'll send them to you. And if you could, Marin, if you would like it and are able to contact Kari, and then Tanil and Sarah, I'll just send them to you.
Yeah, no, that would be so great. Okay, and then we either need to have a part 2 or I just need to have my own personal session with you. Continue to discuss and bounce ideas and things off because seriously, I have been, my mind is like, if I only knew that, that would make my life so much easier.
I was just going to say this. This is because Kari and I have bonded over both having ADHD. And this is what, like, this is the point is like, you can't change who you are, but you can support how you interact with the world. And you are perfect the way you are. Like, you are unique in a beautiful and wonderful way. Don't try to change yourself, but let's like give each other tools so we can show up as our best selves, you know? So don't want to make you late. And thanks everyone who came.
You're so great. Thank you so much, Molly. So appreciate it.
Okay, we'll see you soon.
Hey, thank you. We'll see you.